Cages of obligation. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, casting long shadows across marble floors that had never felt like home. Elena Rosa sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed, still wearing the white dress from the courthouse, the fabric wrinkled where she'd slept in it, or rather, where she'd pretended to sleep. The marriage certificate lay on the nightstand, the ink not yet fully dry, as if the universe hadn't decided whether to make it real. She heard the sound of a shower running in the master bathroom. Thomas Hart, her husband now, a word that tasted foreign on her tongue, was getting ready for the day. Or perhaps hiding. She understood hiding. She'd become an expert at it over the past 3 months, ever since her father had called her into his office and explained how her small architectural firm would collapse under the weight of the Martinez account, how her 15 employees would lose their jobs, unless she agreed to a strategic alliance. The alliance had a name. It was Thomas. Thomas had been given a different story. His family's corporate empire was bleeding money from the failed merger with Rosa Developments. Someone had to take responsibility. Someone had to fix it. Marriage, in their world, was just another contract. A very expensive one. When Thomas emerged from the bathroom, he was fully dressed in a charcoal suit, every dark hair perfectly in place, his expression as carefully arranged as his appearance. They looked at each other across the bedroom like two actors who'd forgotten their lines. Elena noticed he was holding a tablet, a document already displayed on the screen. "I thought we should establish some protocols," he said, moving toward the kitchen area. His voice was polite, the way you might speak to a new colleague. "To make this work smoothly." Elena followed him, watching as he placed the tablet on the marble counter. The document was titled Cohabitation Guidelines. She scrolled through it: separate bedrooms, already handled, designated kitchen hours, a shared household account, expectations regarding public appearances, guidelines for family dinners, and a clause about discretion regarding personal relationships. "You made a contract about us," Elena said quietly. "I made a contract about logistics," Thomas corrected, and there was no coldness in his tone, which somehow made it worse. This was how they would survive. This was how they would fail. Elena picked up the tablet and signed the document electronically. Thomas looked relieved, then guilty, then relieved again, the emotions flickering across his face too quickly to fully land. When he reached out to take the tablet back, their fingers almost touched. Both of them pulled away as if the contact might burn. "The firms are expecting us at the office this afternoon," Thomas said. "We should probably decide on a story. Something about love. They'll expect a love story." Elena nodded, returning to the bedroom to change out of the wedding dress. As she unbuttoned the fabric, she caught her reflection in the mirror, a woman trapped in white, already beginning to fade. Thomas was right. They would need a story. But the story they lived would be far more complicated than love. Or perhaps it would become love precisely because it started with nothing else. The truth beneath. The Hart family estate sat like a monument to old money and older expectations. Thomas's parents had requested his presence for a family discussion, a euphemism that meant his father was about to make demands. Elena wasn't invited. Thomas understood that this was intentional. Margaret Hart, Thomas's mother, served tea in the parlor where Thomas had been taught never to cry. His father, Robert, cut directly to the reason for the summons. The divorce papers were prepared. A prenuptial agreement made the separation clean. Thomas could move on to a suitable partner now, perhaps even Catherine, who had always been a more appropriate choice. The Rosa family's interests had been protected long enough. The arrangement had served its purpose. Thomas listened to his mother discuss the logistics of dissolution like she was planning a dinner party. He thought about Elena in their penthouse, probably packing. He thought about David's contract on her desk, the way out she'd been considering. He thought about how his family had always believed they could purchase love through strategic marriages and calculated choices. "No," Thomas said simply. His father set down his teacup with deliberate care. "No. I'm not divorcing Elena. I'm not considering Catherine. I'm not protecting your business interests anymore." Robert Hart's face darkened in the way that had once terrified his son. "You understand what that means for the company? The shareholders? Your entire future." "I understand that my future stops being real if I keep letting you construct it for me," Thomas said. He stood, and the action felt like shedding a cage. I'm leaving Hart Industries. I'm leaving the board. I'm leaving the expectations. I'm keeping my wife. Margaret went pale. Robert rose from his chair, and for a moment, Thomas thought his father might strike him. Instead, Robert walked to the window, his back turned. If you do this, you're no longer a Hart. Thomas realized his father meant it. That was the price of choosing love over legacy. And standing there in that parlor where he'd been molded into someone else's vision, Thomas found he could pay it without hesitation. Elena was at the airport when he found her. Her suitcase was already checked, her boarding pass in her hand. She looked like she'd been crying, the kind of crying that came from making a decision you weren't sure you could survive. I was going to send you a letter, she said when she saw him. I thought it was easier than watching you try to convince me to stay. I'm not here to convince you to stay, Thomas said. I'm here because I'm coming with you, unless you don't want me to. Thomas, your family is no longer mine, he said simply. I chose you. Not because I had to. Not because it was strategic. But because somewhere in this year of trying to survive each other, I fell in love with you. And I couldn't watch you leave without knowing that I'd at least tried to make you believe it. Elena stared at him, her hand trembling around the boarding pass. David offered me everything. Partnership, autonomy, the life I always wanted. I know, Thomas said. And if that's what makes you happy, then we go. We leave everything behind and we build that life together, if you'll have me. What about your dreams? Elena asked. Thomas smiled, and it was the first smile that didn't have careful edges. My dream is you. Everything else is just the life we build after we figure out that we're allowed to be happy. Elena dropped her boarding pass. It fell to the airport floor like a released breath. She picked up her suitcase instead and took Thomas's hand. The garden grows. 3 years later, the community center on the corner of 5th and Meridian was the most beautiful building Elena had ever created. It rose from the neighborhood like a statement: sustainable materials, natural light, accessible design, built with the intention that people would thrive inside it. The dedication plaque read Rosa Architecture plus Hart Community Initiatives, and Elena still got emotional every time she saw Thomas's name beside hers, a permanent marking of the partnership they'd built. Thomas had become a photographer. Not the society photographer his mother had once joked he'd be, but someone who documented the real world, the buildings Elena designed, the communities they served, the people who moved through spaces and made them alive. His exhibition at the Modern Art Museum was called The Woman I Chose, and when Elena walked through it for the first time, she wept in a way she'd never expected to. There were photographs of her everywhere, Elena in the morning light of their apartment, still reaching across the bed for him. Elena at construction sites, barefoot and glowing, pointing at something in the distance. Elena laughing with her team of architects. She'd started her own firm, small and intentional, designed around human values instead of profit margins. Elena sleeping, reading, thinking. Elena dancing alone in their kitchen at midnight. Elena building a garden on their apartment balcony, coaxing things to grow in a place that had once felt barren. When did you take these? Elena asked, standing in front of a photograph of her crying on the library floor, Thomas's hand reaching toward hers. She didn't remember him having a camera that night. I've been taking pictures of you since our 2nd month of marriage, Thomas said, standing beside her. When you started to become real to me. When the distance between us stopped feeling like protection and started feeling like loss. There are so many, Elena whispered. Because I couldn't stop looking, Thomas said simply. Because the more I looked, the more I understood. You are the most extraordinary thing I've ever seen. Not because you're beautiful, though you are, but because you choose. Every day, you choose to show up. You chose to turn down David's partnership so you could build your own firm. You chose to leave your family business to actually help people. You chose to stay with me when it would have been so much easier to leave. Elena turned away from the photographs and toward her husband. He was wearing a navy suit that reminded her of the one he'd worn to their courthouse wedding. But his eyes were different now, not careful, not distant, but completely open. I chose to stay because I stopped being afraid, Elena said. I was terrified of caring about you, Thomas. Because I thought if I let myself love you, I'd lose myself like I nearly lost myself in everything else. But you showed me that love doesn't consume, it builds. They left the gallery and walked through the city to the community center Elena had designed. It was early morning, before the children's programs began, and they sat on the bench in the main hall, watching the light move across the wooden floors. Somewhere in the walls, they could hear the echo of what would come: laughter, learning, community, all the things they'd built by choosing each other. "Do you regret how it started?" Thomas asked. "The obligation, the families, the contracts?" Elena considered the question. "No," she said finally. "Because everything good in my life started with you. And sometimes the most important gardens grow in the most unlikely soil." Thomas reached for her hand, the same gesture he'd made in the library 3 years ago. And this time, neither of them let go. The weight of silence. 6 months into the marriage, the penthouse had become a museum of avoidance. They had perfected the art of coexistence. Thomas left for the office before Elena woke, returned late, and retreated to the guest room that had become his bedroom. Elena kept to her study, where blueprints and renderings replaced conversation. They communicated through notes on the counter, messages on shared apps, the kind of efficiency that made heartbreak feel professional. Sophia, Elena's best friend, had stopped asking how the marriage was going. She simply showed up on Thursday evenings with wine and the unspoken permission for Elena to fall apart. Tonight was no different, except Thomas was home early, and Sophia had stepped out to take a call, leaving Elena in the living room alone when the crying started. Quiet at first, then the kind of sobbing that comes from months of pretending not to exist. Thomas found her in the library, sitting on the floor behind the leather armchair where she thought no one could see her. His first instinct was to leave, to preserve the careful distance they'd maintained. Instead, he sat down on the floor beside her, his back against the bookshelf, and for several minutes, neither of them spoke. "I turned down the Martinez account expansion," Elena said eventually, her voice rough from crying. "They offered me triple what they'd initially promised. It would have tripled the firm. I could have made partner." Thomas turned his head to look at her. "Why did you turn it down?" "Because my father called me 2 days before they made the offer. He said the company was struggling again, that they might need another strategic alliance soon. I realized I was only valuable to you, to my family, because I was a business arrangement. And that's all I'd ever be." Thomas closed his eyes. "Elena, the merger didn't fail on its own. It was sabotaged." "I know. The investigation concluded." "I sabotaged it," Thomas interrupted quietly. "My father wanted to acquire your firm, strip it for assets, and fold your employees into our operations. You would have been demoted. Your team would have been dissolved. Everything you built would have been absorbed into Hart Industries like it never mattered." Elena sat frozen, processing this. "Why would you do that?" "Because I was reviewing the due diligence files, and I read your architectural philosophy. I saw the projects you'd pitched: affordable housing, sustainable community centers, buildings designed for people instead of profit margins. And I thought about how much the world needs people like you. How much smaller the world would be without your voice in it. So you burned everything down to save me." "I burned everything down because I couldn't let my family destroy you. And then my father decided the only way to control the damage was to control you differently. He suggested marriage like it was a business merger. And somehow, I thought if I married you, I could protect you from the inside." Elena looked at him, really looked at him for the first time since their wedding day. Thomas Hart, heir to a corporate empire, the man who'd been made into her cage, had chosen her before she even knew she needed saving. "We've been living like strangers," she whispered. "Because I was terrified of what I'd become if I let myself care about you," Thomas said. "I already sabotaged my family's legacy for you. I didn't know what else I might destroy if I stopped being careful." Sophia returned to find them still sitting on the library floor, but Thomas's hand had found Elena's, and neither of them was letting go. Cracks in the foundation. 1 year into the marriage, everything changed and nothing changed, sometimes in the same moment. Elena and Thomas had started sleeping in the same bed again, started cooking dinner together, started having conversations that lasted longer than logistics. They hadn't said "I love you" yet, They still moved around that phrase like it was a trap, but something had shifted from obligation toward choice. It felt dangerous and tentative and real. Then David called. Elena didn't recognize his voice at first because it had been 3 years, and people change, and grief gets smaller when you don't feed it. But David, her ex-partner, the man she'd almost married before family pressure redirected her toward Thomas, was opening a firm. He wanted her as a partner. He wanted her back in his life, even if the rest of it was just about business. The offer came with everything she'd ever wanted: creative autonomy, equal equity, the ability to build something that was entirely theirs. She didn't tell Thomas immediately. She let the possibility sit inside her like a secret, examining it in the dark hours when Thomas was asleep beside her. This was the life she would have lived if her father hadn't needed saving, if the Rosa firm hadn't been on the brink of collapse. This was the life she deserved. Thomas found the contract on her desk. He recognized David's letterhead immediately. He didn't confront her about it. Thomas had learned that confrontation was a language that only made them both fluent in hurt. Instead, he withdrew, gently, like he was backing away from a ledge. He started staying late at the office. He stopped reaching for her at night. Elena noticed the distance but told herself it was fair. Thomas had never really chosen her, he'd been forced into it. Now that she had a real choice, shouldn't he understand if she made a different one? The charity gala became the place where everything broke open. Elena arrived in a midnight blue gown that made her look like herself again, independent, untethered, whole. She'd decided to take the partnership. She just needed to tell Thomas. Instead, she found Thomas with Catherine. His ex-fiancée was draped against him like a possession, her hand on his chest, her head tilted toward his in that intimate way of people who had history. Catherine had always been the appropriate choice: old money, family connections, the kind of woman Thomas's parents had groomed him to marry before the Rosa business had complicated everything. Elena watched from across the room, frozen in her midnight blue dress, and realized something that felt like a landmine. She had believed Thomas had chosen her. She had built a life on the foundation of that belief. And now that belief was crumbling like old brick. Thomas looked up and saw her. His expression went through several transformations: confusion, then guilt, then understanding. He moved away from Catherine, but it was too late. Elena had already turned away. They didn't speak in the car home. They didn't speak when they arrived at the penthouse. But when Elena reached for the papers on her desk, the partnership contract, the visa applications David had included, the blueprint for a future that didn't include Thomas, she found Thomas standing in the doorway. "Are you leaving?" he asked, and his voice sounded like something breaking. "Are you asking me to stay?" Elena replied. Neither of them answered. And in that silence, everything they'd built in a year of trying began to fracture into dangerous questions neither was brave enough to ask.